Hello, you're listening to the Public Rail Now podcast. I'm your host, Adam Barrington. On this episode, I'm joined by Mark Dimondstein, president of the American Postal Workers Union. We talk about the threat of privatization facing the US Postal Service and other public institutions, the Trump administration's attacks on workers and unions, the 1970 Postal Workers Strike, and much more. For more information about the American Postal Workers Union, please visit APWU.org, and to get involved in the U.S. Mail Not For Sale campaign, check out usmailnotforsale.org. To learn more about Public Rail Now, please visit publicrailnow.org. Thanks for listening and enjoy.
The U.S. Postal Service is apparently the next target of President Trump.
The fear is that privatizing the Postal Service would severely impact mail delivery or maybe even stop it in some places altogether.
This isn't a new goal for Trump, per se. I mean, over the years, he's repeatedly said he's open to privatizing the Postal Service.
The Trump administration's crusade to cut government may be coming to the post office.
President Donald Trump is reportedly considering a plan to privatize the U.S. Postal Service. It's a move that could impact mail service across the country.
Well, there is talk about the Postal Service being taken private. You do know that. Not the worst idea I've ever heard.
The worst idea I've ever heard.
All right, President Dimondstein, thank you so much for being on the Public Rail Now podcast. We could just jump right in here. The first thing I wanted to talk with you about is this leaked document from Wells Fargo. So for listeners who don't know, in February, Wells Fargo equity analysts circulated a document within the banking industry arguing that postal privatization could be a huge moneymaker for investors. So what have you heard about this? Can you tell our listeners more about this leaked Wells Fargo document?
Well, sure. And Adam, thanks so much for having me on. So the Wells Fargo document, before we get into the specifics, I think sort of the mile-high view will help. And that is when you deal with the question of the public commons, the public good, the public entities like the Postal Service or like Amtrak, it's becoming a clear struggle of Wall Street versus Main Street. And what I mean by that, if you take the Postal Service, the institution, the services that it provides to the people of the country, if the Postal Service was privatized, everybody would lose except the Wall Street investors. And so we frame the issue of privatization of Wall Street versus Main Street. They want their greedy hands on the public money. We want to make sure that the public good is there to continue to serve the people of the country. And in the postal world, there's no form of privatization that would enable the people of the country to have universal mail services, no matter where we live, no matter who we are, for affordable, uniform rates. So that's kind of the background. As you got Elon Musk running around the country, hollowing out government, it's really a billionaire coup going on. So now we get Wells Fargo really salivating over all this talk about privatization. So on February 27th, the equity research arm of Wells Fargo, which is responsible for making investor recommendations and making analysis of where the good investment opportunities are, they jumped in and said, wow, this will be great for our investors. Because if the Postal Service is privatized, and they lay it right out in the report, I call it the smoking gun. They say that the Postal Service rates are 25 for parcels, and they're focused on packages, that the Postal Service rates are 25 to 60% less than UPS and FedEx, i.e. the private side. So they're acknowledging basically that the public sector is the low-cost anchor for the people of the country. And what they say in this report is, if the Postal Service is fully privatized, which would be a great thing for them, or even partially privatized, in particular, like taking out the whole parcel side and put it into the private world, that rates would have to go up on the postal side between 30 and 140%. And they call it, Wells Fargo calls it better parcel pricing. Now, better for us, the people of the country, means affordable rates, especially in a world of e-commerce. For them, for Wall Street, what they mean by better parcel pricing is their ability to raise rates, make more profit, have more investment opportunities at the expense of the people of the country. So they're really trying to, they're piling in to help pick the pockets of what belongs to the people of the country, pick the pockets of the people, and turn it over to Wall Street. So in many ways, Adam, we think that report is very helpful for people to understand what's driving all this privatization thrust. And it comes down to profit, getting there. The post office creates about over $80 billion of revenue a year off the users, no taxpayer dollars, off the postal users, stamps and other products. And Wall Street wants their hands on that. And they see a new opportunity with all the talk coming out of this White House. Secretary of Commerce Ludnick wants their hands on it. He's another privatizer, another Wall Street billionaire, and of course, none other than Elon Musk, the wealthiest person on earth. They went before J.P. Morgan, Wall Street again, and said just a couple weeks ago, Elon Musk, are for privatizing everything. And he singled out Amtrak and the United States Postal Service.
Yeah, I mean, even in the report, it's, and I like the way that you put it, that it's a smoking gun. It's, it says, in order to drive efficiency and maximize value, especially amid recent DOGE efforts on federal cost control, it is likely that employees receive a type of deferred buyout offer to leave, or layoffs could ensue. So it's all like in black and white right there.
Yep.
Degraded services, higher prices for customers, and obviously the gutting of the workforce. And there's a section that says challenges to privatization that I thought was interesting, because it mentions that the USPS is popular among the general public and labor, and there's federal support, but especially rural communities love the USPS. And because private companies aren't beholden to the USPS's mandate to ensure that every domestic address can be reached, privatization would be a total disaster for folks in rural communities in particular, would it not?
Yes. And you hit it right on the head. Privatization generally will raise prices, lower services, and gut decent living wage union jobs, which then spins off into making stronger communities. So, yes, and there's no way, if the Postal Service was privatized in whole or in major parts, that there would be universal service to every address, no matter who we are, where we live. That would definitely hit the rural communities very hard. It would also hit a lot of urban communities, because there's a lot of the private side will only go where they can make a profit. And the Postal Service is a wonderful national treasure set up by law to serve everybody. It's not supposed to be a money-making machine. It's supposed to be service with an attempt to break even from year to year, and along the way be a model employer with decent wages and benefits.
Right. And we're talking about the US Postal Service. I think you've put it this way, it's the low-cost anchor of a $1.2 trillion mail and shipping industry that supports more than 7 million jobs in communities across the country. And it generates nearly $80 billion in revenue each year. And that's, like you mentioned, that's $80 billion that is in the public domain that Wall Street investors can't get their hands on. And that really seems to be, sticking in their craw, that all this money is just sitting there away from their greedy hands. And
it's important for the listeners and the people of the country to understand, once again, what drives this privatization thrust. Because they throw all this propaganda out there, the private sector can do it more efficiently, blah, 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 blah. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with profit opportunities for these billionaires, the investors of UPS, FedEx, and it's actually pretty simple to understand what's happening. But you talked about the part of the report that said the obstacles or the challenges. That is the good news in the report. They also acknowledge, meaning Wells Fargo, that this isn't going to be easy for them, because we are popular, we are trusted, we go to every address, it's mandated by Congress. And that underscores that they know they're going to have to get through to people of the country. So in the report, they also talk about how they can finagle this thing through. For example, they talk about, we don't think we can get it legislated by an act of Congress to destroy the post office, but maybe we can attach it to a must-pass bill, such as a budget or a reconciliation bill, and then it goes through, and all of a sudden the people are left hanging with no public postal service. So they're actually looking at specific tactics on how to overcome what they consider the challenges, i.e., the people trust, need, respect, and use the public postal service.
Yeah, and I've been a longtime supporter of, USPS, and the U.S. Mail Not for Sale campaign's been around for quite a long time now. So that we see all the time these attacks on the Postal Service, and for some reason this feels kind of different at this time. Like I'm even thinking of the DeJoy resignation. He was no friend of postal workers or the Postal Service in general. But even it wasn't enough for him to resign for Trump, and like I said, this seems like it's a hostile takeover is what it feels like.
Yes.
Is that your impression as well?
Yeah, I think it's a whole different level. You are correct that the privatization issue has been there for generations, but it's never been at this level where they're this aligned, they're this moneyed, they're pushing out the hollowing out government with this billionaire coup, and going back a little further, the right-wing Heritage Foundation has had the Postal Service in its sights since its inception, I think, in the early 1980s. And right now, they're basically running the Office of Management Budget, which is part of the White House. So, and it's interesting you raised that the PMG's resignation. I think that fits into what's happening here, because I may have a little different view than you on what he did in his 5 years. I think there were some challenges he was trying to address. We had some serious disagreements on the way some of the implementation was going on, but there was a fundamental need for change, because the habits of the people of the country and the way we communicate with each other in the day of the internet has fundamentally changed. But with all PMG DeJoy's weaknesses and some strengths, he was not a privatizer. He didn't prove to be a privatizer, and he was bringing some work back in. We certainly negotiated a decent union contract last round, and so what happened is he was an obstacle to those who really want to kill this public institution. So he had to go. There's no question in my mind. I don't have the proof in hand, but there's no question in my mind that he was forced out. And that just shows how serious the privatizers are about trying to get their claws, either the whole postal system or major parts of it. So we right now, the Board of Governors, the Postal Board of Governors, they part of their duties is to hire and fire PMG. So they're now in that process, and we're urging them to make sure that the next PMG believes in the public mission, respects workers' rights, and the workers who make the institution go round, and will fight against any efforts to privatize and break up what we call a national treasure.
Yeah, it absolutely is a national treasure. And I also wanted to ask you about that Washington Post report that came out that talked about how the Trump administration will soon issue an executive order firing the Postal Board of Governors and place the Postal Service under the control of the Commerce Department, which, as far as my understanding, that's illegal.
It's absolutely illegal, but we're functioning. It's illegal because Congress established the modern post office in 1970, specifically as a quasi-independent federal agency. The reason being to keep political meddling out of the postal system and make it independent. So to seize it and put it up under another entity, i.e., in this case, the Commerce Department, would be completely against the law. To go in and fire the Board of Governors would be against the law. The law is set up where they're nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and once they're in, they're in. But we're also functioning in a moment where apparently there are no guardrails and there is no rule of law. So we don't know what they are going to do. That executive order has not come out as of yet. There was already an uproar, and it's possible that kept that order at bay, or it's possible they're working on something similar, and you never know what to expect from day to day, except they're on a rampage against unions, against workers' rights, and against the public good, and against government services that the people of this country need, and that includes postal services.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you, there's that horrible, that executive order that Trump had signed that was just a major assault on the union rights of public workers. And
right.
Do you think that's a sign of things to come for organized labor as a whole? Like, it seems like this could be setting a precedent in that the Trump administration could just target unions in general.
I think you're absolutely right. They're going to start with the federal unions, going to go to target the postal unions. They're going to target public sector unions throughout the states. But that's all a slippery slope. You know, when Reagan went after Patco, the air traffic controllers, exhausted, tired, trying to deal with short staffing, and they went out on strike and they were fired by Reagan and that administration. It deeply impacted in a negative way the entire labor movement, even till today. It just set everybody back. So every time the bosses succeed in destroying unions, we're all in that line of target. That becomes a slippery slope for all of us. So the labor movement definitely needs to stand together. Ben Franklin was the first postmaster general. By the way, the post office is about to celebrate its 250th anniversary this coming July, older than the country itself. But I think it was Franklin that pegged the term where, we're either going to hang together or we're going to hang separately. And if we don't stand with the federal unions now under attack, that executive order basically ripped up union rights and union contracts for almost 1 million federal workers around some bogus security measure that the president pulls out of his pocket.
Yeah, and you called it the most serious attack on unionized workers in this country in at least a generation. And
right.
Yeah, so in terms of organized labor, people that sympathize with unions or are in a union family, what can folks do? Do you think, and is there any talk in labor leadership about any kind of bold tactics or strategies that we're thinking about implementing? Because this wrecking ball doesn't seem to be stopping.
Well, I can't tell you what's being talked about behind closed doors. I certainly hope there's a lot of talk. Look, workers have a hell of a lot of power. It's a question of whether we're going to use it and how. And so I certainly hope there's discussions about leverage and pressure points, but we also have to educate our own members and the working class as a whole as to what's happening. Divide and conquer works if we don't find a way to overcome it. And that's the oldest tactic of the working class. There's an old robber baron from the previous century that I think it was Jay Gould, one of the notable robber barons, they called him back then. We got new robber barons now, but he had a quote saying, "I can hire one half the working class to kill the other half." And if we allow that to happen, then they're going to win. And if we overcome that, then we're going to win. So right now, one of the main tools that they are using to divide us is telling private sector workers, you're getting ripped off with your hard-earned tax dollars by these fat cat federal workers. Big lie. We're getting ripped off by the ruling class. We're getting ripped off by tax breaks for the wealthy and the corporations, et cetera, et cetera. But we're going to have to overcome that division to make sure that we stand together with the federal workers that are now in the on the front lines of these attacks. And if we don't do that, we're all in line. And if we do that, then I think we have a really good chance of winning. So I'm sure there are discussions going on, not just amongst union leadership. I'm sure workers themselves are talking about how to best fight back. And I was encouraged that there were a lot of folks in the streets Saturday on April 5th, basically with the slogan, hands off, meaning hands off public services. Hands off what the people of the country need. Hands off the workers that provide these services. And of course, one of our slogans in the postal world right now is hands off the public postal service. So those demands and maybe a couple million people getting in the streets are a good start. Not an end, but a beginning.
Definitely. In kind of just in general, the attacks on public institutions, schools, libraries, USPS, right. Amtrak, like we've already kind of discussed how privatization impacts workers, communities. It's a total, there's not really a positive to be found in terms of the privatization of public institutions, but still there's this, pervasive, widespread idea of, the government can't do anything right and the public sector is inefficient. How can listeners confront those ideas and challenge them when they hear them from friends, family, and coworkers?
Well, I think there are a couple ways. One is when they talk about, for instance, in the Postal Service world, when they talk about how privatization's worked in other countries, it hasn't. So, for instance, in Great Britain, that was where Royal Mail was largely privatized, maybe about a decade back. To mail a first class letter in Great Britain, a lot smaller landmass than the United States, it's over $2 a letter. Ours is 73 cents, where you can go from where I live in Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles, 73 cents. So privatization doesn't work, and we have plenty of proof that it raises costs. The other thing I think people could certainly talk about to their family, their friends, their coworkers, neighbors, and so on, is that there's no way in the Postal Service world that if it's based on profit, that everybody will have these services. There are whole swaths of the country that won't have any mail left, or the services will be drastically reduced because somebody cannot take a letter. Some private entity just isn't going to make any money doing it, and they're not going to do it if they aren't going to make any money. So public service becomes key. So the other thing I failed to mention. So for those who want to help defend their public postal service, defend the workers, our website is apwu.org. And if they do apwu.org/action, there are a number of actions that people can take. There's the question of calling Congress. There are petitions. There are leaflets that people can take, download, take out to their community organizations when they have a meeting. Share it. And just right now, we just really need people, one, to understand it's really a threat, and the threat is real. And that these billionaires are not playing. And then once we understand the threat, to really speak up and be heard, put their pressure on their congressional reps. No way are we going to allow this post office to be taken from us.
Yeah, and one of the threats that I wanted to bring up, that, I mean, there's this whole question of the vote by mail. You know, the Trump administration has been very hostile towards that. But the USPS is actually an instrument of democracy in that it allows people to vote from anywhere, you know, regardless of their income, whether they're in an urban environment or a rural or suburban. So really, this is also about the right to the ballot box. So an attack on the USPS is an attack on voters' rights.
That's right. That's right. During a pandemic, well, vote by mail has become ever more popular over the years, and it's proven to be safe, secure, fraudulent-free, and all that stuff about rigged elections because of vote by mail is just part of the big lie. There's just no facts to back it up. During the pandemic, 65 million people were able to cast a ballot, have access, as you pointed out, access to this cherished right to vote through the public postal system. And in the last election, it was over 40 million. That's 40 million people that may not have been able to vote, may not have been able to wait in long lines, may not have been able to get off from work to be able to even vote. So I think you've hit the nail on the head. And it's interesting, I think, for your listeners to know that the vote by mail system started in the Civil War, where the Union troops were not able to vote unless they were able to vote through the mail. And then it actually developed over the decades. Largely, the absentee voting was largely for military personnel who were not necessarily in the United States or in their regular state, because they may be at a particular base somewhere. And then it grew into much more than that. So there's some states where vote by mail is now, from dog catcher to president, you have to vote by mail. Many states, it's no fault vote by mail. And it's interesting that when you raised the PMG, who now has resigned, in 2020, there was a lot of struggle about having successful vote by mail. And there was a lot of legitimate public outcry. We were part of it in the American Postal Workers Union. At the end of the day, postal management, through that pressure, but postal management did the right thing. I'm not sure that the President of the United States has ever forgiven the leadership of the post office at that time for finally ensuring that vote by mail worked for all of us. And there's a lot of other really important rights. For instance, our 90% of VA medicines are sent through the mail. That's our veterans. What happens to that if it's privatized? So again, that ability to serve everybody with needs, with rights is really critical. And it's interesting you raised, Adam, the vote by mail question, because there was an executive order a week or two ago that also attacked vote by mail. And basically, it's trying to take away the right of the states to determine when that ballot will be counted. Some of the states, it has to be in the election office that day. Some states, it just has to be postmarked that day, and then there's a 3-day window or a 5-day window. This executive order, and hopefully it won't stand the test of law, but this executive order says that it has to be in the election office that day for a election ballot through the mail to count. Now, what does that do to military personnel overseas, for example? And so that is another ominous order that's targeted at our democratic rights.
You had brought up the Postal Reorganization Act, and that 1970 postal workers that it's a wildcat strike. I wanted to ask just if you could tell our listeners, why was that such an important strike, and do you think there's anything that workers in both the public and private sector can learn from that strike and how to respond to these crises and attacks on workers and their unions today?
Yeah, well, that's what drove that strike. Well, first off, people may not know it was an unlawful strike. Postal workers technically by the law did not have, quotes, the right to strike, but nobody can take from workers a fundamental right that we have to withhold labor. And things had gotten to the boiling point. There was, we called it back then, there wasn't collective bargaining, which is what we have now, where you sit down with management, you negotiate terms and conditions of employment. And hopefully you reach an agreement. If not, we have a way now where we go to arbitration to get a final contract. Back then, we had what was called collective begging. Our unions did not have the right to negotiate over wages and benefits. And there were postal workers in urban centers all over the country that actually qualified for food stamps. The pay was so low. The working conditions were so dire. And people had just had enough. And there was a lot of political activity at the time. The Vietnam War was raging. The civil rights movement was growing. And some of that probably impacted the militancy of the postal workers at the time. But basically, Congress gave themselves a big raise, and the postal workers didn't get anything. And they actually walked. Now, back then, postal workers had tremendous leverage. There was no internet. And literally, 200,000 postal workers shut down the financial center of the United States of America, i.e. Wall Street. We were talking about Wells Fargo earlier. All of them stopped. And the government, so postal workers defied their bosses. They defied the President of the United States. They defied their government, and they defied the military troops that came in to try to move the mail, and they couldn't. And so that's an example of real workers' power, where they brought the financial apparatus to a standstill. And that's when postal workers won the right to true collective bargaining over wages and benefits, led to the Postal Reorganization Act that we talked about earlier. And it set the stage for building on really good contracts going forward. So I think there are some valuable lessons. Sometimes you got to storm the heavens. People have to take chances. We have interviews with folks who were on strike back then that basically say, look, we didn't know if we were going to have a job when we were done, but we knew we had to do what we had to do. And we didn't just do it for ourselves, they say. They did it for future generations. So when workers get that spirit of determination and unity and are ready to storm the heavens, then a lot can happen on the positive side of the equation.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. And one last thing I wanted to talk about here before I let you go, I want to respect your time. So in addition to protecting public institutions, Public Rail Now and in other groups are very much of the opinion that we should be fighting to expand public ownership in areas that are currently under private control. So in particular, we are talking about the freight rail system. And, the problems that were brought to the surface on the railroad during the 2022 battle between workers and the Class 1s, they remain largely unresolved. And the highly unpopular contract that was forced down rail workers' throats was like salt in the wound, But you were among one of the only labor leaders out there who said what needed to be said and had the courage to say so, that if they truly care for the national interests rather than the massive private profits and greed of Wall Street and the rail owners, then Congress should seriously consider nationalizing the railroads and running the essential rail network of our country as a national public treasure similar to the public postal service and afford full collective bargaining rights for the workers. So first of all, thank you so much for saying that. And two, I wanted to, kind of see, do you still are you of the same opinion today? And, I'm
100%, I'm 110% today. Look, the Postal Service is a great example where essential services should be in the public domain. And rail, whether it's passenger or freight, is really a fundamental, essential service. On top of that, in the public sector, you're going to have safety would be paramount. What happens on the safety issue is that gets in the way of maximum profit. So that's how you get things like East Palestine. I'm saying Palestine, I think is how it's pronounced. And that was clearly, the lengthening of the trains, the cutting back on how many workers are on these trains, the track inspections, the train inspections, all of this stuff is cut back when there's a drive for maximum profit. In the public domain, that takes center stage. So service becomes the main aspect when it's in the public domain. So the threats to our communities with these giant trains coming through, not staffed properly, not inspected properly, most of that would be much better addressed if it was in the public sector. And believe me, if the railroads were nationalized, as they are in many countries, if it was nationalized, if it was owned by the people, I am sure rail workers would have sufficient paid sick leave, for example, would be able to be off when they're sick without being harassed, that there would be better staffing on the trains that would make our communities much safer. So, yes, I'm absolutely for the public sector. And that, again, gets back to Wall Street versus Main Street. If it's about the Elon Musk of the world, privatize everything. Everything is in the private sector. Keep it there. If it's about the public good, there's tons of national essential services that should be in the hands of the people. And I think rail is one of them.
Great. Thank you so much. I wanted to give you another chance again. Tell our listeners, where can they go to learn more about APWU's fight against privatization of USPS, US Mail Not for Sale, and ways that they can get involved?
Okay. APWU.org/action. And also there's a website, US Mail Not for Sale. I can't sit here and tell you what the domain is, but if you Google US Mail Not for Sale, it will come up. A lot of information there, and a lot of information you can not only get yourselves, good listeners out there, but you can share with your coworkers, your family, your friends, your neighbors, your community, allies. And we have got to let the powers that be, these billionaires, know hands off our public services. They belong to the people, not to the billionaires.